On a clear day from the battlements of Bamburgh Castle, you can see the Farne Islands to the southeast, the cluster of rocky outcrops where St. Cuthbert spent the last years of his life as a hermit in the 7th century, and where Grace Darling made the rescue in 1838 that made her the Victorian age's first media celebrity. Behind you, the castle walls rise from a volcanic dolerite crag 45 meters above the North Sea. Ahead, the beach runs for miles in each direction. The view has not changed in any fundamental respect for 1,500 years. That continuity is the real story of Bamburgh Castle, not the Victorian restoration that gives it the silhouette visitors photograph, not the Norman keep that Henry II commissioned in 1164, not even the Anglo-Saxon kings whose seat this was for 2 centuries of Northumbrian power. All of that is real and genuinely extraordinary. But the deepest truth about Bamburgh is that people have been holding this rock for reasons that are fundamentally the same since before the Romans arrived, before the Anglo-Saxons, before any of the political entities whose names we recognize. The castle's own website states it directly. A fortress of some sort has been standing on this site for at least 1,400 years. That conservative estimate is about a third of the actual documented story. The rock was occupied in the Bronze Age, around 1000 BC. The Iron Age Votadini tribe built a hill fort here. The post-Roman Brittonic kingdom of Bernicia used it as its probable capital from around 420 AD. The Anglo-Saxon king Ida seized it in 547 AD. The fortress changed hands between Britons and Anglo-Saxons 3 times before the Angles secured permanent control in 590. It survived a Viking sack, a Norman reconstruction, Scots invasions, wars of the Rose's artillery, centuries of neglect, and a Victorian billionaire's restoration project. England as a political entity was not formally constituted until the 10th century, when King Ethelstan united the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms after 927 AD. The rock at Bamburgh had been a royal seat for 3 centuries before England existed. The kings who held court here were not English kings. They were the kings of a world that England would eventually be built on top of. This is the castle that predates England. This is its story. It is also, in a less obvious way, the story of how England came to be, how a Brittonic rock became an Anglo-Saxon royal seat, how that royal seat became the center of a Christian cultural revolution, how that Christian culture became the foundation of the intellectual world that produced Bede and the Lindisfarne Gospels, and eventually the idea of England itself. You cannot understand England's origins without understanding Bamburgh. You cannot understand Bamburgh without going back much further than the Normans, much further than the Vikings, much further than the Anglo-Saxons, back to the rock itself, to the dolerite crag that the sea has been wearing at for 300 million years, that Bronze Age people began fortifying 3,000 years ago, and that has been a seat of power for every ruling class that the north of England has known. Chapter 1. The Rock and its Earliest Peoples, Votadini, Bronze Age, and the Brittonic Kingdom, 800 BC to 547 AD. The rock itself is the beginning. The crag at Bamburgh is dolerite, igneous rock, volcanic in origin, part of the geological formation known as the Wind Sill that runs across northern England in a series of dramatic outcrops. Hadrian's Wall follows a section of the Wind Sill westward from the coast. The Farne Islands are outcrops of the same formation, visible from Bamburgh's battlements. The rock on which the castle stands was not placed here by human decision. It was formed by geological forces approximately 295 million years ago, when molten magma intruded into the surrounding sedimentary rock and cooled into the hard, dark, wave-resistant dolerite that makes this particular point of the Northumbrian coast so dramatic. The first people to recognize the military potential of this natural platform arrived in the Bronze Age. The Bamburgh Research Project, which has been excavating the site and its surroundings since 1996, established through radiocarbon dating, that there was occupation of the rocky knoll around 1000 BC, the Late Bronze Age, roughly contemporary with the height of the Mycenaean civilization in Greece and the construction of the later stages of Stonehenge. The Bamburgh's Bones website records the finding. There was also occupation in the Late Bronze Age, around the 10th century BC. High-status Bronze Age burials in the fields south of the castle, in cists, stone-lined graves, beneath mounds that were once thought to be Bronze Age barrows, suggest that the area around the rock was significant enough to be a burial place for important people. By the Iron Age, the rock was the site of a substantial hill fort. The History Tools account identifies the occupants as the Votadini, a Celtic tribe that controlled much of what is now southeastern Scotland and northeastern England, who constructed a hill fort on the rocky plateau, likely a wooden palisade enclosure, taking advantage of the site's natural defenses. The Votadini's territory stretched from the Firth of Forth in the north to the Tyne in the south, and their principal strongholds included Traprain in East Lothian and the Rock at Dingwairdy, the Brittonic name for Bamburgh. Iron Age pottery, tools, and weapons found during excavations confirm the importance of this settlement. It may have been a tribal capital. The Romans, who established their frontier across northern Britain with Hadrian's Wall from 122 AD, recognized the Bamburgh Rock's strategic value without necessarily building a permanent installation there. Their road network and coastal logistics made the site useful as a lookout and communication point. But the Romans never built the enduring stone fort here that they built at other points along the Northumbrian coast. The site's post-Roman significance was to emerge from the British populations who remained after Roman governance withdrew. The 5th century AD was the period in which the Bamburgh Rock acquired its first clearly documented political significance. As Roman administration collapsed and the provincial system that had governed Britain for 4 centuries dissolved, power reverted to local rulers of British, Celtic, in modern terminology, descent. The historical sources suggest that the region around what would become Northumbria was organized into several British kingdoms, and that the rock at Bamburgh, then known as Dingwairdy or Dingwairdy in the Brittonic language of its inhabitants, was a significant center of power. The monarchy's fandom account gives the founding date as circa 420 for the use of Dingwairdy as a capital, and the Bamburgh Bones website confirms Bamburgh, like Edinburgh and Dumbarton, is believed to have been the focus of a British kingdom in the immediate post-Roman period. The kingdom in question was the early form of Bernicia, a Brittonic political entity in the northeast, its name surviving as the Latinized Bernicia in later Anglo-Saxon usage. The Gododin people, the Romanized Votadini, were likely among the dominant group. This Brittonic Bernicia held Dingwairdy as its probable capital for over a century before the Anglo-Saxon invasions reached it. The Brittonic kingdom that held Dingwairdy in the 5th and 6th centuries was the context into which the Anglo-Saxon invasions arrived. The Brittonic rulers of Bernicia were not a static or passive population waiting to be displaced. The Welsh language poetry that preserves the memory of this period records fierce resistance, the battles of Urien of Reged, the sieges and counter-sieges, the coalitions between Brittonic kingdoms that attempted to roll back Anglo-Saxon expansion. The military history of the late 6th century on the Bamburgh Rock was not a simple story of conquest. It was a sustained conflict in which the fortress changed hands multiple times and neither side achieved permanent control for decades. Into this world came Ida. Chapter 2. Ida and Bebba, the Anglo-Saxon Seizure, and the Kingdom of Bernicia, 547 to 617. The year 547 is the first written reference to Bamburgh in the historical record. The 9th century Welsh monk Nennius, drawing on earlier sources in his Historia Brittonum, records that in that year the Anglo-Saxon ruler Ida joined Dingwairdy to Bernicia, that is, annexed Dingwairdy into Bernicia. The All That's Interesting account of the castle notes that, in 547 AD, the chronicler Nennius records that the Anglo-Saxon ruler Ida seized Bamburgh and fortified it, making it the capital of his kingdom of Bernicia. Ida was, as far as the historical record can establish, the first of the Bernician kings whose dynasty would shape the following century of northern English history. He built a wooden stockade and timber stronghold on the rock, turning the existing Brittonic fort into an Anglo-Saxon royal centre. The History Tools account notes he is credited with building the fortress, originally fortified with wooden palisades and earthworks. These were the kind of defences appropriate to the military technology of the 6th century. Not the stone walls that would come later, but substantial enough to defend the rock against the counterattacks that followed immediately. The fort did not stay in Anglo-Saxon hands for long after Ida. The Brittonic kingdoms of the north, particularly the powerful kingdom of Reged, probably based in Cumbria, continued to contest control of the Bernician territory. The monarchy's fandom account records that after Ida, after passing between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons 3 times, the fort came under Anglo-Saxon control in 590. The Bamburgh Bones account adds the historical detail. Stories of conflict between this dynasty and their neighbours and rivals, particularly a king of Reged, probably Cumbria, called Urien, is preserved in Welsh language poetry. The battles for Bamburgh in the late 6th century were remembered and commemorated in a Welsh literary tradition that preserved the memory of Brittonic resistance to Anglo-Saxon expansion. Urien of Reged besieged the fort at Bamburgh. The Bamburgh Bones account records the historical tradition. He confined Ida's son Theodoric in the fortress of Lindisfarne for 3 days and nights. This is a significant detail. The siege was of Lindisfarne, the tidal island near Bamburgh that would later become the Great Monastery, not the fort itself. The geography of the siege reflects the interconnected nature of the Bamburgh Rock and the Northumbrian coastline as strategic theatre. After 590, when Anglo-Saxon control became permanent, the fort passed to Ethelfrith, one of the most consequential and least celebrated rulers in early British history. Ethelfrith was Ida's grandson and the king who transformed Bernicia from a contested frontier chiefdom into an expanding power. He conquered Dara, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom to the south, covering modern Yorkshire, uniting the 2 kingdoms for the first time into what would become Northumbria. He defeated the Scots at the Battle of Degsastan around 603, eliminating their ability to threaten the north. He defeated the Welsh at the Battle of Chester around 616, cutting off the Welsh-speaking Britons of Wales from those of northern Britain. It was Ethelfrith who gave the fortress its enduring name. He gave the fort to his wife Bebba, and it became Bebbanburgh, Bebba's stronghold. The name would undergo various phonetic transformations over the centuries: Bibanburg, Banburgo, Bamboro, Bamboro, Bamburgh, but all variants derive from the same queen's name. Bebba is one of the most obscure figures in early medieval history. She is known only from this single act of naming, but her name has survived in the name of the castle for 14 centuries. Ethelfrith was killed in 616 at the Battle of the River Idle by Edwin of Dara, who then ruled a united Northumbria. Ethelfrith's sons fled into exile among the Scots and the Irish. They would return. The broader significance of Ethelfrith's kingship is often overlooked in the shadow of the more celebrated Oswald. But Ethelfrith was the architect of Northumbrian power. His conquest of Dara united the 2 Anglian kingdoms into what would become the most powerful political entity in Britain. His victories against the Scots and the Welsh established the territorial extent that Northumbria would hold for its golden century. The Bamburgh fortress that he received from his father and gave to his queen was the centre from which this power was exercised. The onomastic evidence alone, the survival of Bebba's name in the castle's name for 14 centuries, tells us something about the cultural significance of the moment. In an age when most women are invisible in the historical record, A queen's name was attached to one of the most important fortresses in Britain and has persisted through every subsequent political transformation. Bebbanburgh, Bamburgh, the queen endures in the name, while the kings endure only in the chronicles. The years between Ethelfrith's death in 616 and Oswald's return in 634 were politically turbulent. Edwin of Northumbria, who had driven Ethelfrith's sons into exile, was himself a significant ruler. He was baptized a Christian in 627, and his conversion brought Roman Christianity to Northumbria through the bishop Paulinus. But Edwin died at the Battle of Hatfield Chase in 633, killed by the pagan Mercian king Penda in alliance with the British king Cadwallon of Gwynedd. The subsequent year of rule by pagan kings temporarily extinguished Christian Northumbria and restored the fortress at Bebbanburgh to pre-Christian hands. Into this crisis came the exiled sons of Ethelfrith. Chapter 3. Oswald, Aidan, and the Golden Age, Bamburgh as the heart of Christian Northumbria, 617 to 670. The period between approximately 634 and 670 was the most consequential in Bamburgh's history. It was the period in which the fortress served as the royal seat of a king, who was simultaneously one of the most powerful rulers in Britain and one of the most influential figures in the Christianization of England. It was the period in which the pairing of Bamburgh and Lindisfarne, the royal fortress and the island monastery, just 9 miles to the south, became the axis around which one of the most remarkable flowerings of Christian culture in the early medieval world developed. Edwin of Northumbria, who had driven Ethelfrith's sons into exile, was himself converted to Christianity in 627, baptized at York by the Roman bishop Paulinus. His conversion brought a Roman-oriented Christianity to Northumbria from the south. His death at the Battle of Hatfield Chase in 633, fighting against the pagan Mercian king Penda, allied with the British king Cadwallon of Gwynedd, temporarily extinguished this Christianity and restored Bamburgh to the hands of a pagan king. The restoration of Christian Northumbria came from an unexpected direction. Ethelfrith's sons, who had spent years in exile among the Irish and Scottish Christians of Dalriata and Iona, returned to claim their inheritance. Oswald, the most significant of them, defeated and killed Cadwallon at the Battle of Heavenfield in 634, reportedly beneath a wooden cross he had erected before the battle. He became king of all Northumbria and was recognized as Bretwalda, the over-king whose authority other English rulers acknowledged. The Bamburgh Research Project history records Bede's assessment. Oswald brought under his dominion all the nations and provinces of Britain. From Bamburgh, Oswald ruled the most powerful kingdom in Britain, and from Bamburgh he launched the project that would define his legacy, the Christianization of Northumbria through the Celtic Christian tradition he had absorbed in his years of exile. He invited monks from Iona to send a bishop to his kingdom. The first monk sent proved too austere. He was recalled. In his place, the Iona community sent a man named Aidan, mild, patient, genuinely committed to the poor and the marginalized, one of the great pastoral figures of the early medieval church. Oswald gave Aidan the island of Lindisfarne, 9 miles south of Bamburgh, as the site for his monastery. The island was ideal, close enough to the royal seat to maintain royal patronage, isolated enough by the twice-daily tidal crossing to give the monks the separation from the world that their Irish tradition valued. What followed from the Oswald-Aidan partnership is impossible to overstate in its cultural significance. The monastery at Lindisfarne became a center of learning and manuscript production. It attracted scholars and missionaries from across the British Isles and from the continent. In the generation after Oswald, it produced the Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the masterpieces of early medieval European art, an illuminated manuscript whose intricate artwork synthesized Celtic, Roman, and Germanic artistic traditions into something new and extraordinary. The spiritual and cultural world centered on Bamburgh and Lindisfarne was, in its 7th century prime, one of the most sophisticated in all of Europe. The Archaeology magazine account of the fortress records a detail that illuminates the physical character of Bamburgh in Oswald's time. Archaeologists excavated fragments of what appears to be a stone chair or throne, a gift stool in the Anglo-Saxon terminology. Such thrones were central to the fundamental ritual by which a lord bound warriors to his service by giving them gifts in public. The replica of this throne now sits in the central courtyard of the present castle. When Oswald sat on this chair and distributed gifts to his warriors, he was performing the ceremony that made his kingdom function, the ritual that the poem Beowulf described in its most famous passages. Oswald acted as interpreter when Aidan preached. The king himself had learned Irish in his years of exile, and he stood beside the bishop and translated the Irish into English for his own people. The detail preserved in Bede captures something vivid about the relationship between the two men. A king who had absorbed a different culture in exile, using that knowledge to bridge between his Irish-trained bishop and his Anglo-Saxon court. A more unusual relationship between power and religion is difficult to imagine. Bede records another detail that defined the Bamburgh court's character. One Easter Sunday, Oswald was dining with Aidan when he was told that a crowd of poor people were waiting outside the gates. Oswald took the silver dish of food from before him and sent it out to be distributed among them, then broke up the dish itself to distribute to the poorest. Aidan, witnessing this act, seized Oswald's right arm and prayed, "May this hand never decay." The legend of the incorrupt arm, Oswald's preserved right arm, kept in a silver reliquary at Bamburgh after his death, became one of the central miracles of his cult. Oswald died at the Battle of Maserfield in 642, fighting Penda of Mercia. He was killed, and his body was dismembered by the pagan Penda, a deliberate desecration. But his followers recovered his arm and head. His head was taken to Lindisfarne, where it would eventually be buried with St. Cuthbert. His arm was brought to Bamburgh, where it was preserved in a silver shrine in the church. He was venerated as a saint and martyr. His cult spread across England and eventually across Europe. The story of Penda and Bamburgh did not end at Maserfield. In 651, Penda besieged Bamburgh itself, attempting to burn the wooden defenses. The Bamburgh Research Project history records the episode. Penda attempted to set the defenses alight. He took the village apart and used the timber to create a pyre around the castle in an attempt to burn the stronghold to the ground. Aidan, watching from Lindisfarne, saw the smoke and is said to have prayed. The wind changed direction and blew the smoke and fire back at the Mercians. Bamburgh was saved. Aidan himself died later that year, 651. Some accounts say he was leaning against a buttress of the church at Bamburgh when death came to him. Chapter 4. Cuthbert, Wilfrid, and the Synod. The kingdom at its cultural peak, 670 to 793. The death of Aidan in 651 and the subsequent political violence in Northumbria. Oswald's brother Oswy murdering his southern counterpart King Oswin in the same year to reunite the kingdom under his own authority might have ended the Lindisfarne-Bamburgh cultural project before it reached its greatest achievements. Instead, the decades that followed produced the Lindisfarne Gospels and the career of St. Cuthbert. Oswy's reign consolidated Northumbrian power and produced the Synod of Whitby in 664, one of the most important events in English ecclesiastical history. The Synod settled the question that had been simmering since Paulinus brought Roman Christianity to Northumbria from the south, while Aidan brought Celtic Christianity from Iona. Which tradition would govern the English Church? The specific practical question was the dating of Easter. The underlying question was whether English Christianity would be aligned with Rome or with the Irish-Scottish tradition. Oswy ruled in favor of Rome. The Celtic tradition's distinctive practices were abandoned. The English Church became definitively Roman in orientation. Bamburgh's role in this period was as the royal seat from which this momentous religious politics was conducted. The Northumbrian kings who followed Oswald and Oswy, Ecgfrith, Aldfrith, Osred, held court at Bamburgh while Lindisfarne reached the heights of its literary and artistic achievement. Cuthbert, who became the most celebrated of all the Northumbrian saints, was prior and then bishop of Lindisfarne between 664 and his death in 687. His relics, after various peregrinations driven by Viking raids, would eventually find their permanent home at Durham Cathedral. But the tradition that produced him was rooted in the community that Oswald and Aidan had established, centered on the axis of Bamburgh and Lindisfarne. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced around 715 to 720 A.D. by the monk Eadfrith, bishop of Lindisfarne, represent the apex of this tradition. The manuscript's artwork synthesized Celtic interlace patterns, Roman figurative traditions, and Germanic animal ornament into a visual style that had no parallel in Europe. It was created as an act of devotion to Cuthbert. The book was made to honor the saint whose relics gave Lindisfarne its spiritual authority. And it was made in a community that existed because Oswald, king of Bamburgh, had invited Aidan from Iona and given him an island 9 miles from the royal fortress. The Bamburgh Research Project has excavated the Bole Hole Cemetery 300 meters south of the castle, which may be the burial ground of the royal court of this period. Between 1998 and 2007, archaeologists found the remains of 120 individuals dating to the 7th and 8th centuries. What they found was extraordinary. The Bamburgh Bones account and the current archaeology analysis both emphasize the diversity of origins revealed by isotope analysis. These individuals had come from Ireland, Scotland, Scandinavia, the Mediterranean, and North Africa. The royal court at Bamburgh, in its 7th and 8th century prime, was not a provincial settlement. It was connected to a world that extended from the Near East to Scandinavia. The Archaeology magazine account describes one of the most striking finds: a man buried with evidence of a severe leg wound that had been cared for over years before his death, suggesting sophisticated medical treatment. Artifacts found with the burial and radiocarbon dating show that the man lived in the 7th century, around the same time as Oswald. Perhaps he accompanied the famous king back to Northumbria as part of his retinue. The physical remains from the Bole Hole are the closest we can get to the actual people who populated the Golden Age of Bamburgh, not the kings and saints whose names appear in the chronicles, but the warriors, craftsmen, traders, and pilgrims who made the royal court function. The Bamburgh Beast, the gold plaque discovered by archaeologist Brian Hope Taylor in the 1960s, is similarly evocative. The beast is a fragment of decorated metalwork from the 7th century, its intricate animal ornament placing it firmly in the tradition of Northumbrian artistic production. It was presumably made for or owned by someone of high status at the Bamburgh court. The Bamburgh sword, found in the same period of excavations, is one of the finest early medieval swords discovered in England. These objects are not the property of a marginal settlement. They are the products of a royal court at the peak of its cultural confidence. The zenith lasted, in cultural terms, from approximately 634 to the 790s. The Bamburgh Bones website summarizes, Bamburgh maintained its status as a principal royal center until the fragmentation of Northumbria during the later 9th century. The later 7th and early 8th centuries saw Bamburgh continue to function as the administrative center of Northumbrian power, even as the specific character of that power evolved. The construction of major monasteries, at Jarrow, where Bede would write, at Wearmouth, at Whitby, which became the burial place of the Northumbrian kings, redistributed some of the cultural and religious functions that Bamburgh had concentrated in the Aidan-Oswald generation. But the fortress remained the royal capital, the place where kings held court and conducted the central rituals of political authority. The Hild, Saint Hilda, who founded the double monastery at Whitby in 657, was another figure of extraordinary significance who operated within the orbit of the Bamburgh royal court. The Bamburgh Research Project history notes, "She founded a new abbey at Whitby, which became the site of burial for the Christian kings of Bamburgh. Even in death, Bamburgh's kings were bound to the monastic network that the Aidan Project had created." The burials at Whitby expressed the continuity between the royal court at Bamburgh and the religious institutions that court had patronized. The first warning of what was coming did not arrive from the fragmentation of Northumbrian politics, but from the sea. Chapter 5. The Viking Century, Raids, Resistance, and the Ruin of Northumbrian Power, 793 to 993. On June 8, 793, Viking ships appeared off the coast of Lindisfarne. The raid that followed, the sacking of the monastery, the killing of monks, the theft of the treasure that the community had accumulated over a century of production and donation, was the event that announced the beginning of the Viking Age in England. The Northumbrian scholar Alcuin, then at the court of Charlemagne, wrote in horror, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." He was right that nothing quite like it had happened before. He could not know how much worse it would get. The History Hit account records the sequence that followed. The attack on Lindisfarne was just the opening salvo in a relentless Viking assault on England's shores. Bamburgh itself survived the initial raids. The rock and its defenses were a harder target than an island monastery. But the world around the fortress was being systematically dismantled. Northumbrian power fragmented. The kingdom that had once had all the nations and provinces of Britain under its dominion was reduced decade by decade to a rump around its northern heartland. In 866, a Viking army that the Anglo-Saxon chronicle calls the Great Heathen Army captured York, the southern capital of Northumbria, the seat of the Darran half of the kingdom. York became Jorvik, a Scandinavian city. The southern half of Northumbria, Dara, was absorbed into the Danelaw. What remained of Anglo-Saxon Northumbrian power contracted to the north, to Bernicia, centered on Bamburgh. For the next century, Bamburgh was effectively the last surviving capital of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had been one of the most powerful in Britain. The History Tools account is explicit. Bamburgh managed to avoid the fate of other Northumbrian settlements like York, which fell under Viking rule. The survival of Bamburgh was thanks in large part to the efforts of leaders like Uhtred the Bold, an Earl of Northumbria who helped defend the castle against the Norsemen. The northern rump of Northumbria, centered on Bamburgh, held on while everything around it changed. In 993, it finally ended. The all that's interesting history is vivid. In 993, Vikings ransacked Bamburgh, seizing war booty and burning buildings. Viking axes battered the skulls of monks. In return, the English nailed skins flayed from their Danish enemies onto church doors. The fortress that had been a royal seat for 4.5 centuries, the place where Oswald had ruled and Aidan had died and the incorrupt arm had been venerated, was burned and looted. What the Vikings left behind was ruin and disrepair. The kingdom of Faiu, Northumbria, already fragmented, was effectively finished as an independent political entity. When England, the unified kingdom that Aethelstan had created after 927, eventually absorbed Northumbria, it was absorbing the remnant of what had once been the most powerful kingdom in Britain, reduced by a century of Viking pressure to a ruin on a rock. The Viking raids that ended Bamburgh's Anglo-Saxon Golden Age also ended the world that had produced Bamburgh's greatest cultural achievements. Lindisfarne was attacked multiple times. The community eventually abandoned the island in 875, taking Cuthbert's relics with them on a wandering that would last over 100 years before they found a permanent home at Durham. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced in the 710s, survived because the monks carried them in their flight. The culture that had produced that manuscript and the Bamburgh beast was scattered, killed, or driven into exile. The Northumbrian earls who held Bamburgh after the Viking destruction tried to preserve something of the old order. The History Tools account of the period gives credit to Uhtred the Bold, an Earl of Northumbria, who helped defend the castle against the Norsemen. Uhtred, whose story Bernard Cornwell fictionalized in the Saxon Stories novels that gave Bamburgh its most recent popular exposure, was a historical figure who navigated the impossible political landscape of late Northumbria, attempting to preserve his position between Viking pressure from the south and Scottish pressure from the north. He was eventually murdered by a rival in 1016, but not before he had married a daughter of King Ethelred the Unready, and used the connections of England's southern dynasty to maintain his position in the north. The rock remained. The earls of Northumbria clung to it as the emblem of their authority, even as the kingdom whose capital it had been dissolved around them. The rock always remained. Chapter 6. Normans, Earls, and the Making of a Medieval Castle, 993 to 1200. The Norman conquest of 1066 did not immediately reach Bamburgh. William the Conqueror, who crushed the English at Hastings in October 1066 and was crowned at Westminster on Christmas Day, needed years to consolidate his control of the north. The north of England resisted Norman rule with a ferocity that the south had not managed. The harrying of the north in 1069 to 70, William's deliberate devastation of Yorkshire and the surrounding region, which killed tens of thousands through violence and famine, was his instrument for breaking that resistance. Bamburgh's first Norman connection came through the earldom. William eventually granted the Northumbrian earldom to various lords, most of whom found it an ungovernable assignment. In 1095, the earl in question was Robert de Mowbray, who staged a revolt against the crown. The All That's Interesting account records the outcome. King William II of England laid siege to it and captured its owner, Robert de Mowbray, Earl of Northumbria, after he staged a revolt against the crown. The Castles and Legends account adds the dramatic detail. Robert's wife defended the castle after he was captured, refusing to surrender until she was threatened with the blinding and mutilation of her husband. After 1095, Bamburgh Castle became royal property for the first time, and remained so for centuries. The castle's, forts, and battles account traces the institutional history. It was either William I or Walcher who established the first castle on the site, after the conquest, with the Norman stone construction replacing or building on the remains of the Anglo-Saxon timber defences that the Vikings had destroyed in 993. The Great Keep, which still stands, was built under Henry II. The medieval timeline's account gives the date. In 1164, during the reign of King Henry II, a large square Norman keep known as the Great Tower was built at the castle at the cost of £4. £4 is an astonishingly small sum for a construction project that produced one of the most enduring features of the castle, though it likely represents only a portion of the total cost, perhaps the payment to a specific craftsman or supervisor. The keep was the standard Norman response to the challenges of castle building, a massive stone tower capable of serving as the last refuge if the outer defences fell, and as the residential core of the castle in peacetime. Henry's successors used Bamburgh as a royal palace, the All. That's interesting account notes. Henry's successors, including John and Henry III, used Bamburgh Castle as a palace, introducing comforts like glass windows. The castle was evolving from a purely military installation into a combined residence and fortress, the standard trajectory of English royal castles in the 12th and 13th centuries. The castle held King David II of Scotland as a prisoner following the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346, making it one of the sites where the Anglo-Scottish conflict was physically embodied. The Norman castle that replaced the Viking-destroyed Anglo-Saxon fortress was built on the same principles that had made Bamburgh a royal capital for centuries: height, visibility, and the natural defensibility of the Dolerite crag. The Norman builders could not have improved on the site's natural advantages. What they added was stone construction capable of resisting Norman-era sieges, and an organized castle layout with distinct functional zones. The shell keep, the Great Hall, the chapel, the gatehouse. These were the standard elements of Norman castle design, applied to a site that had been a fortress since before Norman concepts of fortification existed. Henry II's Great Keep, built around 1164, was the definitive architectural statement of royal authority at Bamburgh in the Norman period. The All That's Interesting account records the key detail. Henry's successors, including John and Henry III, used Bamburgh Castle as a palace, introducing comforts like glass windows. Glass windows in the 13th century were not a trivial luxury. They represented a significant investment in the comfort and status of the building's occupants. A castle that had glass windows was a palace, not merely a garrison. Piers Gaveston, the favorite of Edward II, whose political prominence was one of the triggers for the baronial conflict that defined Edward's reign, sheltered at Bamburgh during one of the periods of crisis in his relationship with the English nobility. The medieval timelines account records, Gaveston was left behind at Bamburgh Castle, where he was relatively safe from the Lords Ordainers. The castle was sufficiently remote and sufficiently fortified to provide genuine safety for a time. Gaveston was eventually captured and executed elsewhere. Queen Margaret of Anjou, wife of the Lancastrian Henry VI, landed near Bamburgh during the war. Chapter 7. Scotland, David, and the Border Fortress, 1200 to 1455. The 13th and 14th centuries gave Bamburgh Castle its most sustained role as the primary English fortress in the north. The conflict with Scotland, which became the defining military preoccupation of the English crown from Edward I's invasions in the 1290s through to the 15th century, made Bamburgh central to English strategic calculations in ways that no subsequent period would replicate. Edward I, the most militarily aggressive of the medieval English kings, used Bamburgh as a base for his Scottish campaigns. The History Tools account confirms Kings Edward I, Edward II, and Edward III all made use of the castle as a base for their northern campaigns. For Edward I, whose campaigns against Scotland earned him the name Hammer of the Scots, and whose capture of the Stone of Scone in 1296 was intended to eliminate the symbolic basis of Scottish kingship, Bamburgh was the jumping-off point for operations into Scottish territory. The castle's position on the Northumberland coast, within striking distance of the border, made it an ideal supply depot, command center, and refuge. The castle's role in receiving distinguished prisoners is a recurring theme in its medieval history. In 1346, following the English victory at the Battle of Neville's Cross near Durham, the captured Scottish King David II was held at Bamburgh. The Ancient History Sites account identifies this episode. The castle held King David II of Scotland prisoner following the 1346 Battle of Neville's Cross. David had invaded England while Edward III was conducting his French campaigns, gambling that the English home front was underdefended. He lost. His capture at Neville's Cross and his 11-year imprisonment in England were the direct consequences. The castle also provided refuge for one of the most politically sensitive figures of Edward II's reign, Piers Gaveston, the royal favorite whose intimacy with the king provoked the baronial opposition that defined Edward's disastrous rule. In 1312, when the Lords Ordainers, the barons who had forced Edward to accept their oversight of royal appointments, were hunting Gaveston, he was sent north to Bamburgh. The medieval timelines account notes, Gaveston was left behind at Bamburgh Castle, where he was relatively safe from the Lords Ordainers. The remoteness of Bamburgh, which had been a disadvantage in terms of royal convenience, was here a strategic asset, a place far enough from the centers of baronial power to provide genuine safety. It did not, ultimately, protect Gaveston. He surrendered at Scarborough shortly afterward and was executed by his enemies. The 14th century also saw Bamburgh figure prominently in the fortunes of Queen Margaret of Anjou. The strong-willed French queen and wife of the unstable Henry VI had more personal political resolve than her husband, and her resistance to Yorkist power in the north made Bamburgh and the other Northumbrian castles crucial elements in the Lancastrian strategy. The medieval Timelines account records that Queen Margaret landed near Bamburgh Castle on the Northumbrian coast with a small army. Her 1462 intervention from France, with French and Scottish support, that briefly restored Lancastrian control of the northern castles. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, the castle was also receiving royal investment and maintenance that kept it in functional condition. Henry III, whose long reign saw elaborate expenditure on royal castles across England, spent money at Bamburgh. The castle was maintained as a royal residence as well as a military installation. The glass windows that Henry III had installed, noted in the All That's Interesting account, were the mark of a building intended for comfortable royal habitation, not merely garrison life. The Great Hall, the chapel, the accommodation blocks, the stables, the castle complex in the 13th century was a substantial administrative and residential center, not merely a defensive position. Royal visits, prisoner management, military logistics, the provisioning of northern campaigns, all of these functions ran through Bamburgh. The castle that Ida had seized in 547, and that the Northumbrian kings had used as their royal seat, had, by the 14th century, become the English crown's primary military installation in the far north. The question of what happened to Bamburgh between approximately 1380 and 1455, the long gap between the major Scottish wars and the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses, is answered partly by the general pattern of castle management in this period. Bamburgh, like many royal castles during the relatively peaceful middle decades of the 15th century, was maintained but not actively developed. The threat from Scotland had diminished without disappearing. The mechanisms of Anglo-Scottish diplomacy had created a degree of stability that made massive investment in northern fortifications less urgent. The castle held its position, managed its estates, and waited for the next crisis. It did not wait long. Chapter 8. The first castle to fall to cannon. The 1464 siege and the end of the medieval era, 1455 to 1500. The Wars of the Roses, the dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York that tore English politics apart between 1455 and 1487, came to Bamburgh with a particular force. The castle's history of changing hands, its position in the north where Lancastrian support was stronger, and its genuine military value made it a primary target when the Yorkists consolidated their position. Henry VI, the weak and intermittently insane Lancastrian king, fled to Bamburgh after his defeat at the Battle of Hexham in 1464. The castle became his refuge. The Yorkist forces, led by the formidable Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, the most powerful nobleman in England, and the man who had made Edward IV king only to turn against him, arrived outside Bamburgh's walls shortly after Henry had fled again. What followed was the end of an era. The History Hit account provides the essential detail. Within his army's ranks, Warwick had, at least, 3 powerful pieces of artillery, dubbed Newcastle, London, and Dizion. Warwick's ultimatum to the Lancastrian garrison was stark. Surrender and all would be spared, except the garrison commander, Sir Ralph Grey. Resist, and for every cannonball fired at the castle, 1 man of the garrison would be hanged when they fell. The garrison refused. The cannon opened fire. The History Hit account records what happened. They unleashed a powerful bombardment on the fortress. The strong Norman walls proved all but powerless, and soon gaping holes appeared in the stronghold's defenses and the buildings within, causing great destruction. Soon large parts of Bamburgh's defenses were reduced to rubble. The garrison surrendered the city, and Grey lost his head. The aftermath gave Bamburgh a historical distinction it has held ever since. It was the first English castle to fall to cannon fire. The Britannica entry on the castle states it plainly. Bamburgh was the first English castle to fall to cannon fire, the nemesis of medieval chivalry, when it was attacked by Edward IV in 1464 during the War of the Roses. The castle's forts and battles account confirms the Yorkists bombarded the castle with cannon fire until one of the towers collapsed, the first instance of a castle falling to artillery on the British Isles. This is not merely a footnote. It is a statement about the transformation of military technology that the 1464 siege made visible. The walls that had been built to resist attack by siege engines, scaling ladders, and mining could not resist sustained artillery bombardment. The age of the medieval castle was, effectively, over. The message that the history hit account draws from the siege is clear. The message was clear. The age of the castle was at an end. The Lancastrian commander Sir Ralph Grey, who had refused to surrender, was executed. The history hit account confirms Grey lost his head. The garrison that had refused to yield was at the mercy of the Yorkist army. The castle that had held kings and saints and prisoners of war for 9 centuries was in rubble and submission. The castle remained heavily damaged for the next century and more. Warwick had no particular interest in preserving the military capability of a Lancastrian stronghold. What damage his cannon could not inflict, neglect would. The once great royal fortress of the most powerful kingdom in early medieval Britain was a ruin, not for the last time. The 1464 siege's distinction as the first English castle to fall to cannon fire deserves to be understood in its full historical context. Medieval castle design had been evolving for centuries to resist the specific threats of the pre-gunpowder era. The scaling ladder, the battering ram, the trebuchet, the mine. Walls were thickened to resist impact. Towers were positioned to provide flanking fire. Moats were dug to prevent approach. Bamburgh's Norman walls, built and reinforced over the preceding 3 centuries, represented the accumulated wisdom of medieval military engineering applied to an already naturally defended site. None of it mattered against sustained artillery fire from weapons that could be moved to advantageous positions and maintained at distance from the defenders. The revolution that Warwick's 3 cannon demonstrated at Bamburgh in 1464 would be confirmed at castle after castle across Europe in the following century. The castle's forts and battles account summarizes the significance accurately. The first instance of a castle falling to artillery on the British Isles marked a fundamental change in the strategic logic of fortification. After Bamburgh, castle design would have to incorporate the reality of cannon fire, or cease to be militarily relevant. The age of the castle as a primary instrument of military power was ending. The rock at Bamburgh, which had been the most important military site in northern England for 1,500 years, would henceforth be primarily a historical monument. Chapter 9. Neglect, Restoration, and the Victorian Reinvention, 1500 to 1900. The 3.5 centuries between the 1464 siege and the Victorian restoration of Bamburgh Castle were a long diminuendo. The castle that had been the seat of Northumbrian kings, the most powerful fortress in northern England, and then a royal palace passed through various hands in various states of disrepair. After the Wars of the Roses, the castle remained a royal possession for a time, but the Tudor monarchs had little practical use for a remote northern fortress that was expensive to maintain and no longer relevant to their military strategies. The Scottish border conflict, which continued to trouble the north throughout the 16th century, was managed through other means. Bamburgh declined. In the 17th century, financial difficulties led to the castle deteriorating. The All That's Interesting account notes, parts of it were used as a pharmacy, a hospital, and a free school for impoverished students. This philanthropic repurposing reflects the castle's reduced status. A building that had once housed kings was now being used for charitable institutions. Lord Crewe, the Bishop of Durham who acquired the castle in 1704, established a trust to manage and maintain it. The All That's Interesting account traces the management. Small sections of the structure were restored. Parts of it were used as a pharmacy, a hospital, and a free school for impoverished students. The Crewe trustees' management kept the castle from complete collapse, but could not restore it to anything approaching its former significance. The transformation came in 1894 with the purchase of the castle by William Armstrong, Lord Armstrong of Cragside, the Victorian industrialist who had made his fortune in hydraulics, artillery manufacture, and eventually in virtually every dimension of late Victorian heavy engineering. Armstrong's firm, Armstrong Whitworth, manufactured guns, warships, and armor plate. He was, in the language of his era, a magnate, the kind of man whose wealth and energy could reshape landscapes. The castles.org account records Armstrong's achievement. He invested considerable funds to fully restore the castle and transform it into an architectural masterpiece. The restoration was carried out between 1894 and 1904 by the architect C.J. Ferguson, using squared sandstone and ashlar masonry. The Victorian restoration gave Bamburgh the silhouette it has today. The towers, the battlements, the coherent medieval appearance that draws photographers to the beach below. The restoration was not purely conservative. Ferguson and Armstrong created a castle that was simultaneously a genuine historical structure and a Victorian interpretation of what a medieval castle should look like. The 14 staterooms that visitors explore today include Victorian additions and Victorian interpretations of medieval spaces, alongside the genuinely medieval Great Keep. The King's Hall, with its carved oak paneling and stained glass, is Victorian work. The library contains books collected by Armstrong himself. The Armstrong and Aviation Artifacts Museum, in the castle's old laundry rooms, covers Armstrong's manufacturing, empire, and its military applications. Armstrong himself was one of the most significant figures in Victorian Britain's industrial and military complex. His hydraulic crane revolutionized port operations across the world. His breech-loading artillery, developed through Armstrong Whitworth, became the standard for the British Army and Navy and for dozens of foreign military forces. By the time he purchased Bamburgh, he was a baron and a philanthropist, as well as an industrialist, and his purchase of the castle reflected a Victorian aristocratic sensibility that sought to identify manufacturing wealth with historical legitimacy. The connection between Armstrong's career, which was essentially the application of scientific principles to the manufacture of ever more powerful weapons, and the history of the site he purchased is not without irony. Bamburgh Castle was, in 1464, the first English castle to fall to cannon fire. Armstrong spent his life making cannon. The man who made his fortune from the technology that made medieval castles obsolete purchased and restored the most famous castle to have been destroyed by that technology. He also installed the Armstrong and Aviation Artifacts Museum in the castle's laundry rooms, ensuring that his own engineering legacy was displayed within the historical shell of Northumbrian power. The restoration that Ferguson conducted between 1894 and 1904 was, by the standards of the time, relatively conservative. The aim was to make the castle habitable and coherent, not to reconstruct what had been lost in the 1464 siege or the subsequent centuries of neglect. The Great Keep, which Henry II had built in 1164 and which survived both the artillery siege and the subsequent disrepair, was incorporated into the restored structure and remains its most genuinely medieval element. The squared sandstone and ashlar masonry of the restoration work surrounds the Norman core, giving the castle its current appearance of completeness. The result is a building that is many things simultaneously: an Iron Age hilltop settlement, a Brittonic royal capital, an Anglo-Saxon royal palace, a Norman castle, a medieval fortress that resisted Scotland and fell to cannon fire, a Victorian restoration project, and an Armstrong family home. The current castle is all of these layers at once, and unpicking which elements belong to which period is an exercise in archaeology and architectural history that the Bamburgh Research Project has been undertaking since 1996. Chapter 10. What the Archaeology Knows, the Bamburgh Research Project, and the World Beneath the Castle, 1960 to present. The official history of Bamburgh Castle is the story told by the chronicles and the documentary record. Ida seizing the fort in 547, the Northumbrian kings, the Viking raids, the Norman reconstruction, the medieval history. The archaeological history is something different, richer, stranger, and in some ways more revealing than anything the written sources contain. Systematic archaeological investigation of Bamburgh began in the 1960s, when Dr. Brian Hope Taylor of Cambridge University undertook the first major excavation of the fortress site. Hope Taylor was a significant figure in Anglo-Saxon archaeology. He is best known for his work at Yeavering, the great Anglo-Saxon royal palace in Northumberland that was Bamburgh's peer as a royal centre in the Golden Age. At Bamburgh, he found the Bamburgh beast and the Bamburgh sword, the gold plaque, and the high-status weapon that placed the 7th century royal court at Bamburgh in the first rank of Anglo-Saxon material culture. Since 1996, the Bamburgh Research Project has been conducting ongoing excavations at the castle site and the surrounding area. The project, directed by various scholars and led for many years by researchers from Durham University, has transformed understanding of the site's prehistory and early medieval history. The Bamburgh Research Project website describes the current focus. Our current area of excavation is St. Oswald's Gate and the outworks beyond. The project offers public participation. Visitors to Bamburgh can watch or even participate in the ongoing excavation work, making the archaeology accessible in ways that most historic sites cannot manage. The Bole Hole Cemetery, excavated between 1998 and 2007, produced the most unexpected results. The 120 individuals buried there in the 7th and 8th centuries were not the homogeneous Anglo-Saxon community that earlier assumptions might have predicted. The isotope analysis conducted by Professor Charlotte Roberts of Durham University and her team established that these people had originated from Ireland, Scotland, Scandinavia, the Mediterranean, and North Africa. The royal court at Bamburgh in its golden age was genuinely cosmopolitan, a place where people from across the known world gathered, served, traded, and died. The current archaeology analysis of the Bole Hole excavation notes the significance of the cemetery's location. The royal court's burial ground was placed in the sand dunes 300 meters from the castle, because the dolerite rock itself made grave digging impossible. This practical constraint explains why the cemetery survived. The sand preserved the bones in ways that shallow graves in the rock would not have. The dunes that covered the Bole Hole burials were themselves only created by storms in the winter of 1816 to 17, which is when the first bones were exposed. Victorian Romantics initially attributed them to Viking raiders. The archaeology established they were the people of the Northumbrian royal court. The fragments of the stone throne or chair excavated at the castle, the gift stool whose replica now sits in the courtyard, provide the clearest physical connection to the ceremony of the Anglo-Saxon court. A lord who gave gifts to his warriors in a formal public ceremony, witnessed by the entire court, was not merely being generous, he was performing the binding act of loyalty that made the political community function. The chair from which Oswald, or one of his predecessors or successors, performed this ceremony is one of the most tangible links to the actual practice of Dark Age kingship that British archaeology has recovered. The radiocarbon dating from the prehistoric layers confirmed Bronze Age occupation around 1000 BC, pushing the site's documented human use back 3,000 years. The Iron Age layers above that contain the material remains of the Votadini hilltop settlement. The early medieval layers contain the Pictish silver brooch that confirms Brittonic occupation. Each layer adds a stratum to the story that the castle's official history tells, in broad strokes, but that the archaeology tells in specific, human-scale detail. The Bamburgh Research Project has also revealed the physical character of the Anglo-Saxon fortress that predated the Norman castle. The great wind-sill dolerite rock that the castle stands on made construction difficult but defensive positions exceptional. The timber halls and wooden palisades of the Anglo-Saxon period, of which almost nothing visible survives above ground, are detectable through the excavation of post holes and building platforms in the rock. The archaeology is building a picture of a substantial and sophisticated royal settlement, not the primitive wooden stockade that popular imagination tends to attribute to Dark Age kings, but a complex of halls, churches, workshops, and residences appropriate to a ruling court of European significance. Chapter 11. What Bamburgh actually means, the castle that predates England, and why it matters. The myth of Bamburgh Castle is the Victorian silhouette, the towers above the beach, the castle that looks the way all castles are supposed to look, the backdrop for film shoots and wedding photographs and tourist postcards. The truth is, everything that preceded the Victorian Restoration, a history so dense and so consequential that the Norman castle that forms the core of the current structure is, in historical terms, one of the more recent layers. The castle's own website makes a claim that is, if anything, an understatement. A fortress of some sort has been standing on this site for at least 1,400 years. By the archaeological evidence, the documented occupation goes back 3,000 years. The political significance goes back at least 1,600 years to the post-Roman Britannic kingdom that used Dinguari as its capital. The fortress predates the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Northumbria. It predates the Viking raids that transformed English culture and politics. It predates the Norman conquest. It predates England. That predates England formulation requires precision. The unified Kingdom of England, the political entity that can reasonably claim to be the predecessor of the modern state, was created when King Ethelstan of Wessex defeated the last Viking king of York in 927 and accepted the submission of the Scottish and Welsh kings, making himself the first king to rule over most of what is now England. That event happened roughly 380 years after Ida seized Bamburgh and made it the capital of Bernicia. England was built on top of a world that Bamburgh had already been part of for 4 centuries. The kings who ruled from Bamburgh, Ida, Ethelfrith, Edwin, Oswald, Oswy, and the long succession of Northumbrian rulers, were not English kings. They were kings of Bernicia and then Northumbria, political entities that were absorbed into England but were not England. The England that would eventually conquer and integrate Northumbria was itself only possible because of the cultural and political groundwork laid in the 7th century by the Northumbrian kingdom, whose royal seat was Bamburgh. The Venerable Bede, whose ecclesiastical history of the English people is one of the foundational texts of English history and English literary culture, wrote at Jarrow, within the Kingdom of Northumbria, drawing primarily on the history of Northumbrian Christianity. Bede's England was Northumbrian England, centered on the cultural axis of Bamburgh and Lindisfarne. The Bole Hole burials, the 120 individuals from the 7th and 8th centuries who came from Ireland, Scotland, Scandinavia, the Mediterranean, and North Africa to serve or trade or settle at the Northumbrian royal court, tell a different kind of story from the one that either English nationalism or Viking romanticism tends to construct. Bamburgh, in its prime, was not a tribal stronghold, but an international place, connected to a world that extended from the Near East to Scandinavia. The idea that the Dark Ages were dark, culturally isolated, intellectually barren, disconnected from the broader world, collapses entirely in the face of the Bole Hole evidence. The first castle in England to fall to cannon fire, the birthplace of the cultural tradition that produced the Lindisfarne Gospels, the royal seat of a king who is both a historical figure and a cult saint, venerated across Europe, the site where St. Aidan died and where St. Oswald's incorrupt arm was preserved, the fortress that 3 times changed hands between Britons and Anglo-Saxons before permanent occupation was established, the rock that Bronze Age people chose to bury their dead near 3,000 years ago. Bamburgh Castle contains more history per square meter, than almost any other site in England. The Victorian silhouette is real and genuinely beautiful. Standing on the beach at sunset and looking up at the castle is one of the more striking views in English architecture. But it is, in the full context of the site, the most recent chapter of a story that began before England, before the Normans, before the Vikings, before the Anglo-Saxons, before the Romans. The rock was here before all of them. The people keep coming back.